Hi everyone, this is acyuta-bhava from Nightlight Astrology, and today we're going to take a look at a chart that was a client's chart whose brother recently passed. Now, the reason that we're doing this chart is because this client's brother had taken his own life, and I'm using this chart both to illustrate some of the signatures of someone taking their own life and how that will sometimes show up in a birth chart. But even more importantly than that, because it's definitely not a formulaic thing. There's not like a three-step process to identifying someone, taking their own life in astrology terms, as far as I know. But more importantly, I get a lot of questions about suicide throughout the year. I see a lot of clients who have contemplated suicide at one point, who may have tried to take their own life, or reached out for help, or maybe they had a family member who passed in this manner. So I should say that if this is a triggery topic for anybody, you feel free to just watch something else. I certainly don't want this topic to be something that induces anxiety or anything like that. But it is an important topic, and like I said, it's one that I get questions about often enough that I sometimes will do a video on the topic. I have a few in my archives. So some of the questions we're going to cover today, while looking at the chart of one of my clients whose brother recently passed by taking his own life, is suicide a fated way of death, or is it reflective of a kind of free will choice that is made and that is avoiding some other perhaps fated way of passing that the birth chart shows? In other words, do birth charts show in advance that a person is going to die by taking their own life? Is that one of the ways that a birth chart can show something or not? And this question about free will and the choice to end one's own life. So those two questions are loaded, right? And I'm not going to pretend like I have all the answers. I'll just do my best to present to you what I've learned so far, what my teachers have taught me, what I've seen in practice over many years, and let it put it into your process and let you think about it. The other question that I get quite a bit is the question of whether or not suicide is sort of punished, or if there is some kind of more difficult fate or karma that awaits a person in the next lifetime if they choose to take their own life. I get these questions so often, so regularly, that again, I thought a video would be good, and I'll give you my take on these topics. But again, like I'm just one person, and I don't claim to be omniscient, so again, hopefully these questions and the reflections on them will be meaningful to you. First of all, the first question that I got from this client that has allowed me to share with you today, and I'm going to put her birth chart on the screen right now, was just very basically, my brother recently passed by taking his own life, and I'd like to know where this shows up in my chart. How can I see it? Where does it appear in your opinion? And then secondarily, can you say anything else about what I'm going through right now? And how to best approach the turbulence of this time in my life. So obviously these are really great questions, just the kind of thing that I think astrology can be really helpful with. We don't have all the answers, but I think astrology provides a really deep and meaningful template for exploring our experiences, making sense of the different seasons of life, and even being able to predict them often with great accuracy. Though admittedly, it's very rarely in my practice that I predict death. A couple of times a year I might get a question, usually with an older family member who's already close to passing, and the question might be about the timing of such a thing. But it's not something that I sit down with. I look at a chart and go, here's how you're going to die. Or ancient astrologers did have techniques for such things, but I think a combination of trying to make sure that we focus on things that don't terrorize our clients, and if you're an astrologer, and also just the fact that even if people did want to know, I think that it's really hard to talk about such things without increasing your anxiety, even if one thinks that they can be objective about it. So Yeah, so anyway, so after the fact though, I do a lot of this kind of thing. So when someone passes, I get questions, probably at least 100 times a year of someone saying, hey, this person in my family just passed. How does it show up in my chart? And oftentimes these questions are from people who are, maybe students of astrology to a certain extent already. So it's not as important to identify this kind of thing in a birth chart with someone, who has no knowledge of astrology, because they won't understand it anyway. But for those of you who watch this channel, you're probably, at least beginner to intermediate students of astrology, if not more advanced, and so you may find this interesting. So first of all, what we want to do is just look at and just take a close look at the house of siblings, because that's the place to start in an inquiry like this. And here we see, most obviously in the house of siblings, Saturn. So one of the malefics is there. Not only is Saturn there, but there's also receiving testimony from an opposing Mars. And so you have a very difficult planet in the third house of siblings receiving that whole sign opposition from Saturn, or from Mars. So right away, you could look at this chart and imagine that the topic of siblings could be difficult. There's a lot of other topics across the third and ninth house axis that could be relevant to a discussion about this opposition between Saturn and Mars as well. But just from the standpoint of evaluating, the karma around siblings, like this would be, a good starting place, just to note that the possibility for difficulty is there. Now, the other thing to look at is always going to be the ruler of the third house. And the ruler of the third house in this case is Jupiter, who rules the whole sign third house of Sagittarius. Jupiter is in the 12th house, and Jupiter is retrograde in the 12th house and in its exile or detriment. So again, right away, that's a very challenging signature that can suggest, among other things, mental or physical health problems, sometimes of a more psychiatric kind of institutions that are associated with the 12th house, a tendency towards dissociation or self-destructiveness, or sometimes addiction or isolating behavior, or ostracization, or being a black sheep or not fitting in. A lot of different significations that can make the ruler of the third and the 12th house challenging around the topic of siblings. Now remember, there's other topics in the third house. We're just focusing on siblings for now. You can also see that when this person was born, Mars, same malefic opposing Saturn, was in a applying square to Jupiter in the 12th. And so here we have yet another sign of difficulty. The other thing that's important to notice is whenever you're examining the ruler of a place, like topical ruler of siblings in this case being Jupiter, Jupiter is not in its own sign. It's in another planet's house. It's in Virgo. It's in Mercury's house. Where is Mercury? Well, Mercury's in the 8th house, the place of death. And that also that's an example of what is sometimes referred to as counteraction, which is to say, okay, so Jupiter rules siblings and it's in the 12th house, but it's not in its own sign. So what does its host have to say? Because if Jupiter is, let's say, a dinner guest and it says, I'm hungry for this type of thing, then its host will have to feed it. So it's getting fed by Mercury in the 8th house, which, among other things, can provide death to Jupiter, if that makes sense. So that you have, again, a variety of signatures in this chart that suggest that the topic of siblings will not be easy. Now, that could mean so many different things, right? So you wouldn't look at this and just go like, oh yeah, so your brother may take his own life or something like that. That would be way too general and not, in astrology, there's a saying that I like to use with my students, which is that if you're an astrologer and you're sitting down with someone and you're going to make some meaningful karmic predictions about their life, if you try to hit the bullseye by making the most concrete, specific prediction possible, it's like throwing a dart at a dartboard. but you're more likely to, if you go for the bullseye, you're more likely to miss the dartboard entirely. Whereas if you are trying to get close to the most general and basic observable themes, it's more like you're trying to hit the dartboard in general. And as a result, oftentimes of trying to hit the dartboard in general, you end up getting really close to the bullseye. So, for example, when talking to this client, you might begin by saying, hey, look, if they know anything about astrology, you can just lay down the basic facts that I just did. You can say, do you have siblings? Yes, I do. Have your siblings ever had any serious mental or emotional health problems, or has there ever been any serious level of conflict with them, or have they been a difficult personality in your life in any way? You can bring up some of the basic ways in which siblings might become difficult. Have your siblings ever struggled with addiction or anything like that? And you can also just say, and if not, no big deal. I'm just asking questions to see what might fit, right? So as astrologers, we don't have to pretend like we are omniscient, right? We're educated karmic weathermen. We're educated karmic guessers, basically. We know the basic outlines of the karma, but because the chart is multivalent, multidimensional, we need a little bit of a conversation to help us kind of register what we're seeing. So asking a question like this could easily lead the client to say, yeah, my brother's had a lot of mental health problems, and I'm really, I've been concerned about him for a long time. He's been in and out of institutions. There's been some addiction problems, whatever the case might be. In this case, that's kind of the storyline that we're talking about, right? So now, again, oftentimes one of the things that kills people when they're studying astrology is what I call paralysis by analysis, which is that there's so much there, and you want to analyze so much, and you want to include so much, and sometimes you can even see so much that you'll start to get overwhelmed and not be able to say the simple, most basic things well. And good astrology happens when we know how to say the most general and basic things well, because that is what connects with people and creates an accurate reading. Starting with basics. Hey, this topic looks like it could be really challenging. Maybe specifically in a couple of different ways. Does that register with you? Yes, it does. Oh my gosh, wow, that's so relevant, right? And how do we know to go to what topic? There's so many topics in a chart. Well, oftentimes you know what topic to go to by virtue of looking at what transits are being made to which planets that have governance over certain topics in the chart by virtue of ruling certain houses. So in this chart, for example, what clues us into the fact that something might be happening with siblings right now? Well, you've got a couple of things happening at once. The most obvious one is that Neptune, a planet that, quite frankly, can very easily be related to the dissolving or the almost like the oblivion that is sometimes, I guess, almost imagistically associated with taking one's own life. The fading or dissolving of one's consciousness, the extinguishing of one's flame. These are Neptunian images, among other things. Neptune can also be about the desire to escape. We're going to talk about that in a little bit, because it's certainly not fair to say that suicide is simply about escape. I'm going to push back on that notion pretty hard. But it can be. Sometimes it is, sometimes it isn't. It's not a stereotypical thing. And I say that as someone who's had experience talking to clients over many years and just learning so much about this topic. As well as having some of those themes in my own extended family. So Neptune is opposing Jupiter, the ruler of the third house, when her brother took his own life. So that is one theme that is a major trigger. And when you see Jupiter getting triggered, you have a number of different topics that could fit into place, right? It's not just siblings. There's Jupiter rules the third, Jupiter rules the sixth. Jupiter has its own natural significations by just being Jupiter. But because Saturn's in the third, siblings and Jupiter rules the third, right? You got this feeling of like, yeah, the third house topics could be really active right now in a challenging way. Okay, among those would be siblings. So that's how you're seeing the potential to inquire in this direction in the first place. But all of this becomes intuitive, by the way, over time with lots of practice. Now, so when the client asks, do you see anything that's really triggering this in particular? Yeah, it's definitely the Neptune opposite Jupiter. But what about other transits? Oftentimes you'll hear astrologers also talk about the rule of three. The rule of three means if you see the same thing being said in three different ways in the chart, it's usually kind of a good sign that something in particular is happening. Some particular type of event or theme is really being manifesting. So the other thing that I think is really important to mention here, even though it's not connected to an exact transit, meaning it's not an exact degree-based transit like Neptune to Jupiter, is that in May of 2018, Uranus ingressed into this individual's 8th house and started approaching the dispositor of Jupiter, right, which is Mercury. So Jupiter rules siblings, its host is Mercury. Uranus ingressed into that 8th house of death, moving towards Mercury in that house. And even though the transit isn't exact, it's approaching Mercury, and it has that signature of the sudden, unexpected death or loss. Now, the other thing that is happening here is we get a lunar eclipse. Eclipses starting to move into the 3rd house of siblings as of June. So you also get eclipses starting to come through the house of siblings. So that, and then, she had asked, is there anything that's going on in my life overall right now that you could speak to as to why this time in my life in general feels so turbulent? Well, how about Pluto in the 4th house of home and family? Track the outer planets by transit, which I love to do. I don't look at the outer planets in natal charts, but I tend to look at them in transits for everything. Now, more about that peculiarity of my practice if you ever take my course. But Pluto in the 4th house, home, family roots, family karma, is squaring this individual's Sun and Venus in the 7th house. Now, the 7th place was called the setting place. It's where planets disappear, and the Sun in particular dies in the 7th house because its light is lost, its sunset. So you have a very strong image of Pluto, the lord of death, the lord of Hades and the underworld, in the roots of the house, in the roots of the 4th house, home and family, squaring the setting sun in the 7th house, and a family member dies. And of course, on a larger, in the bigger, larger sense, that square can point to there being a profound sense of death and rebirth in the individual's life path overall. You've heard me rip on that cliche before, right? Probably if you listen to my channel, death and rebirth, like put a quarter, in the quarter jar. But it's actually, in the simplest sense, that's what occurs when Pluto, makes its way into a relationship with the sun or the moon. There are these profound turning points, especially in a cardinal sign like Aries from a cardinal sign like Capricorn. Cardinal, the word cardinal, the original word for the cardinal signs were tropical. The word tropos meaning turning point, like the equinoxes and solstices. They're these hinge, like pivots, that really dramatically turn your life. And they're not happening all the time, but when cardinal planets get aspected by slower moving planets, there are these seasons of life where there's just such dynamic, intense changes. Of course, we could have a deeper conversation about relationships in this person's life, and maybe the different kinds of things happening in love or marriage or other topics as well, by virtue of Pluto squaring Venus or the Sun. But that's a little broader context to help hopefully this individual will feel they can feel empowered in a sense to know that this is a turning point where my assumptions about life, about reality, about myself are being deeply challenged, and my life path is being reoriented. It will not last forever. This too shall pass. Um, the advice in my own experience of living through so many transits and observing them, actively as an astrologer over the past decade, is to be in it, um, to know that it's a promised time, that it's there for you, and that it has many deep, rewarding gifts. That those gifts will give to you and create a deep, unseen, with Pluto especially, an invisible richness in the substrata of your life if you allow the experiences to be what they are. Don't try to dress them up and make them something good. Don't try to take away the pain or the grief, or the uncertainty or the anxiety, but trust them. Find a way of putting your faith into the experience that you're living in. For me, I have to have a daily meditation practice. That's the only way for me. But whatever it is, find a way of daily surrendering. And with the gods, you think about these planets like gods, understanding that the gods give and they take away. The universe gives and the universe takes away. And when things are taken away, it's really good to open it, although it seems like something is being taken, to open our hands in the midst of a time when it feels like something is being taken away. We stand to receive something as well. And oftentimes I think we miss that because we try to figure out why. What did I do wrong? But having something taken away does not mean that we did anything wrong. It might be painful, but it's always important to sort of surrender with an open heart to what's happening when these difficult transits come, but also keep our hands open. Say to the universe daily, I thank you for these experiences, even though I'm bewildered, even though I'm in pain, and I may not understand how to really feel gratitude, but I'm trying, and please help me receive any insights that would help me to grow, or any insights that would help me to be a more loving person, or to bring more compassion, charity, and sweetness to the world. How do I do that? I don't know. So I'm opening my arms and my heart and just asking. Be in that practice, and these Pluto transits they can be very enriching. And I say that, of course, from the sober perspective of giving a talk, right? It's much easier to say here than it is in the midst of real turbulence. But nonetheless, it's like, even if you've got to dig really deep to get there, that's my advice. Make that the practice. That's the core advice that was given to me by my teachers, especially in the ayahuasca tradition. Where in the ayahuasca tradition, you go through a lot. You go through real darkness. It's very subterranean. It's very Plutonian. You just got to kind of keep your hands and your heart open to receive the experiences. And what emerges over time is the realization too that the only one that can receive such killing experiences, things that seem to kill our joy or our sense of clarity or understanding about life, the only one that can endure those things is the eternal soul, the one that's unborn and undying. And the more we say yes to our experiences, the more that being emerges. And wow, what a wellspring, what a joy, what a happiness, and not a cheap happiness, a deep, unspeakable happiness at times. Pluto, by the way, is like the invisible, secret shadow brother of Zeus. So Zeus is like the overworld optimist. But if you think about Pluto, he's the underworld optimist. So anyway, all right. So that's it for the chart. Now I wanted to get into some of the questions that I get about this topic. Again, these are just my opinions from what I've learned from my teachers, the yoga philosophy, as well as experience with clients. So take it or leave it, and please don't feel like I said, I can't possibly pretend to have all the answers here about such a heavy topic. But let's just talk about the first question. Is suicide a fated way of death, or when a person takes their own life, are they choosing to do so in avoidance of another kind of death that was awaiting them? And here's my thing: is that I feel like um, this question is maybe guilty of imagining that things are overly stereotyped or like overly legalistic. Like uh, as far as I can tell, astrology paints the picture of a universe. So does yoga philosophy, that is so deeply personal, idiosyncratic, unique, multivalent. So I can imagine, I personally, in my experiences too with clients and so forth, I can imagine that at times some people, for the purpose of their own fulfilling their own karmic requirements, as well as for the purpose of their own growth spiritually, meaning their own spiritual journey, you could say, will come into this lifetime on a trajectory that may explore the states of consciousness, the states of experience associated with deep despair, unhappiness, and whatever other genetic or hereditary or psychological or brain chemistry issues could be associated with suicide. It seems to me that in the scope of ultimate reality, that coming and experiencing that fate is a possibility. So I have to entertain that, yeah, in some cases, suicide would be a kind of destiny that the soul could have. How could I see it any other way? But at the same time, I can see it in some other unique lights as well. For example, doesn't it seem logical that in all of reality that some beings would have a particular trajectory of fate, but that we also have free will, that you might be online for a particular kind of destiny path, but then you avoid, avert, or sidestep that path somehow by taking your own life? I think that's a possibility too, right? So again, I don't have the answers, I don't know, but from my experience, I've seen charts where it looks very much like a person for example, some really, really heavy 8th or 12th house placements, Saturn on the sun, where someone might deal with depression really intensely, or many other types of aspects or transits where you go, yeah, it looks like that makes sense. Suicide or taking one's own life makes sense. So it looks as though there's a fated karmic element to it. On the other hand, I know that souls have free will. I believe that very deeply, and I believe that karma is a result of free will, and I believe that some karmas are pretty fixed and others are less fixed. Even in ancient Indian astrology tells us that. Ancient Western astrology tells us that. And so um, I know that choice can intervene, and that the pathway is not entirely fixed. It's not entirely open either. But because I don't know to what extent everything is or isn't fixed, I'm like an educated karmic analyst, but I'm not God. You know what I mean? So like I can, of course, I can imagine a scenario in which a soul might freely choose a way of dying or a path that leads to death, including taking one's own life, that may avert some other destiny that was there for them. So I don't think so. When people say, is suicide always fated, or is it some kind of free will choice that is averting some other kind of destiny that you were supposed to have? I feel like it's a false dichotomy. It's a fake choice. You know what I mean? Like uh, I think both possibilities could exist in the scope of reality. Reality is so personal and so specific to each person and each story. So that's how I look at it. The next two questions were basically, is suicide something that's like punished in the next life, or do you go to some hell space or purgatory for a while, or all these kinds of questions? And then does suicide make your next life more difficult? And again, like from my standpoint, I have to look at the scope of all of reality, and I go, it can't be a stereotyped thing. It can't be a one size fits all answer. Um, we know by study of ancient literature into the science of karma, what does it tell us? That the ancient wisdom traditions tell us that we reap what we sow, and but that it's often very mysterious and it's not always obvious how that works. So, and that our way of judging things, oh, this was bad, so I must have done something bad in the past. Often what appears like a bad is the greatest blessing, and often what appears like a good is the greatest curse. So we can't be too stereotyped in our thinking about things. And because that's the case, I can imagine a way in which uh, suicide may be the very natural burning off of a karma that is resolves something, and then a person goes on. Um, I can also I think about it like this. I mean, this is kind of like a weird. This is going to sound really weird, but like, um, when I was a kid, I remember having this really. And I'm sorry if this is like, probably you guys did this too, but like when I was a kid, I remember taking some orange soda that I was drinking and pouring it down into an ant hill, and like there were tons of ants, and just seeing them all like drown, and like most of them died or whatever. And I remember just immediately feeling such deep guilt. Like, why did I do that? Like, what? That was so mean. And just from a very young age, contemplating how quickly that life had just been extinguished. And I had this perspective being like a giant in comparison to an ant, and being like, well, they have pretty short lifespans anyway. So it doesn't really matter, they're not that, don't live that long, and blah, blah, blah. And I'm contemplating it from the level of my experience. And sometimes in order to understand death, like a human death, I have to remember that on the scope of, eternal reality, to other creatures and other scales of existence, we're like ants. And our life force, it flickers in and out so fast. It feels really long to us, even if you live like 25 years or even 10 years compared to an ant or a mosquito or whatever. But our lives are so fast in the scope of, um, the amount of time a solar system exists, or like that. So um, I have to, all of that is just to say that I personally have to remember that what the ancient mystics told us is that the spirit soul is eternal, it's unborn, and it's undying. And it experiences so many innumerable different kinds of life and births into different forms and deaths. And so if I take that kind of bigger perspective, it really helps to contextualize um, the experiences of death that are harder for me to fathom. Like, there are the equivalents of orange soda pouring on our heads in this material universe as human beings too. There's terrible things that we do to one another, and there's terrible diseases, and all sorts of ways that we die that are, really brutal. And maybe suicide is one of them, and maybe it isn't. You know, I think it's so individual and so personal. So all I can say about it is that it really helps for me to take a kind of big picture perspective and understanding that suicide is one of many ways that a spirit soul will have of passing out of a temporary body, one of innumerable bodies that it will have. And so I can't look at it as a stereotyped thing that, oh, well, that was bad, or this is a natural way to die and that's an unnatural way to die. Well, it's like, turns out they're all natural ways to die. They're all ways of dying. They're all ways of dying for a being that is unborn and undying. That's really the important point. So no, I don't think that suicide guarantees that you had somehow an unnatural death and therefore you'll get some kind of bad karma in the next life. I don't believe that, but I guess I don't believe it because it seems to me like it could be true in some cases and maybe not in others. Um, there are cases in which a person may want to leave this lifetime and be trying to maybe escape from something, and it's like, you could imagine, if you are an eternal, unborn, undying soul, it's like, well, you're not going to escape anywhere because you're eternal. So if you're trying to escape, good luck, because you're going to take another form and you'll have to keep experiencing things. And the Shastras, including the Bhagavad Gita, are very clear that like what you do at the time of death, what you remember at the time of death, what's in your consciousness at the time of death, is part of what shapes the trajectory of your next incarnation. That's the momentum of karma taking us from one form to the next. So, yeah, I think that suicide could shape your next experience, but it doesn't shape it in a stereotyped way, because there are so many nuances and subtleties that are a part of our intentionality. There's ignorance that is forgiven. Like we make choices based on intentions that we have, based on knowledge that we have that's only partially true. Well, the universe isn't here to like beat us up because we had bad intel. It wants to help us get the right intelligence. It wants to help us get the right information about who we are, about what's real, about happiness, about love. And so I can't imagine that leaving in one particular, leaving in one form, that in part of our leaving may have been rooted in some degree of not understanding truth, or understanding ourselves, or understanding divinity, or understanding whatever. And that the universe is just going to hit us over the head for not understanding. If there's an infinite amount of time available to us in the material universe, which is again what the Shastras tell us, Plato said, time is the moving image of eternity. If there's all this time, and there's all this patience, and there's all this grace, and there's all this mercy and love, then I can't imagine that if someone is making a choice rooted in fear, pain, suffering, anxiety, and an inability to understand or get to something that they can hold on to that would be sustaining and helping them move through, that it just flat out, well, that's just it. The only thing that'll happen is that you'll be punished. That's not like, I just can't get into that myself. However, ayahuasca taught me some really important things. Some of my experiences with ayahuasca, for example, showed me that we create through our intentionality, through our ignorance, through our habituation, through our karma, we do have to sometimes experience very hellish things. But again, like those experiences are often very purifying. They burn things off, so to speak. They open our eyes. They show us light and love and truth. If you're an eternal being, you can't be harmed. The temporary experience of suffering or hellishness in the grand scheme of things can very much be a part of the way in which mercy and grace and truth are kind of brought to us. I know that perspective is not easy, but I don't see any viable alternative to explaining why we sometimes experience such tremendously painful and hellish dimensions of reality and yet seem to persist and live and grow. I think it's because the universe is guiding us, and sometimes we take a temporary roller coaster ride through some hellish experiences, but I don't think that it's a cookie cutter formula again. So I can't say, oh yes, just unanimously someone taking their own life means that they're punished for it, or that they'll have a more difficult next lifetime. Maybe, maybe not. You know what I mean? So that's my general answer. Remember, when approaching questions like these are my just last tips, I guess. The soul is eternal. We're not the judge. We're not the judges, and it doesn't help to pretend like we are. There is eternal patience, forgiveness, grace, and mercy. And hell is temporary. Experiences of hell are temporary. The only thing that is actually eternal is the nature of being itself, the divine source and our very beingness, which is by its very nature beautiful, truthful, knowledgeable, blissful, and that's the only thing that's eternally real. The other experiences are temporary, and so the danger lies not really in one way of dying or another way of dying, or one way of living and another way of living. The real danger is in the forgetting of our eternal nature, because that's when we can lose touch with the thing that really keeps us anchored. Anyway, those are just some reflections. I wanted to close by reading you two quotes from one of my favorite books of all time called Suicide and the Soul by James Hillman. You guys probably heard me quote him a bunch before. He says this is from his book. Outside and inside, life and soul appear as parallels in case history and soul history. A case history, he's talking about like a therapeutic setting. A case history is a biography of historical events in which one took part. Family, school, work, illness, war, love. The soul history often neglects entirely some or many of these events and spontaneously invents fictions and inscapes without major outer correlations. The biography of the soul concerns experience. It seems not to follow the one-way direction of the flow of time, and it is reported best by emotions, dreams, and fantasies. The experiences arising from major dreams, crises, and insights give definition to the personality. They too have names and dates, like the outer events of case history. They are like boundary stones, which mark out one's own individual ground. These marks can be less denied than can the outer facets of life. For nationality, marriage, religion, occupation, and even one's own name can be altered. Case history reports on the achievements and failures of life with the world of facts. But the soul has neither achieved nor failed in the same way. The soul imagines and plays. Remember, in the yoga philosophy tradition, we call this lila. The soul plays, the soul imagines and plays. And play is not chronicled by report. What remains of the years of our childhood play that could be set down in a case history? Where a case history presents a sequence of facts leading to diagnosis, soul history shows rather a concentric helter-skelter pointing always beyond itself. We cannot get a soul history through a case history. This is part of a book in Suicide and the Soul, in which Hillman really tries to push back on the notion that there's a lot of taboo and stigma around suicide. And the way that part of it is also the way that we think about people. You're either working properly and your biography is moving along in a nice, tidy, healthy manner, or you're sick, and then we look for how the sickness is, like, where is it, how did it get there, we name it, we label it, we try to treat it and fix it so that we can be ushered from life to death in a clean, nice, comfortable biographically sound manner. You had a nice case history, you ended up okay, you died well, like that. And his point all throughout his book Suicide and the Soul is that oftentimes suicidal ideation, suicidal tendencies, suicidal thoughts, suicidal fantasy, that these come into play specifically when a person feels as though their life is not being honored in terms of a soul history. That the feeling of wanting to leave is sometimes tantamount to wanting to leave the kind of story that we're being told about who we are and why we're here. And he says a lot more too. I don't mean to oversimplify what is a really deep and kind of vast exploration of the topic, but so I pull that quote last because in all of the answers that I gave, I tried to give my best sort of Hillmanian response, which is like, hey, look, it's not a stereotyped thing. There's not just one way of understanding or looking at that kind of an event. And most of all, we can't look at each other as either perfectly normal or somehow broken. If we see each other as eternal spiritual beings who are walking a path guided for us every step of the way, and that path and the way that it's being guided is faithful and true and beautiful, and if we trust that, if we trust who we are in our deepest nature, then we start to become interested in soul history, and we personalize each other, and oftentimes when we start doing that, it's much harder to approach questions about karma in like really legalistic ways, like, well, if you commit suicide then this thing happens next, or well, if you did this then this kind of karma happens. And um, in some ways that way of looking at karma is beset by the same problematic view of the individual that Hillman is describing, if we were to only look at each other in terms of case history. So at any rate, I don't think God looks at us that way. I don't think the universe looks at us as a case, you know? So I think it's much more personal than that. I think we tend to treat each other that way, and so then we ask questions rooted in that mistaken way of seeing one another and of seeing life. So that's what I've got for you. I hope that this was an interesting topic. I know it was a little heavy, and I certainly invite opinions that are different from my own. If you have comments, I'd love to hear them in the chat box. Please feel free to share your thoughts and opinions and experiences. I love reading what you guys have to say. In the meantime, there will be, this is very like Mars square Pluto talk. There will be more to talk about this week with some big transits coming up, so stay tuned, and we'll be coming at you with more soon. All right, take it easy, everyone. Bye.